Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you, and thank you, Eric. Thank you both very much. It's a real honor to be invited to be part of the Budapest community. I want to really start by giving a shout out to Tara Brach and the local Insight community and the wonderful work of the Insight on the Inside group that's arisen out of that. That I think as someone said last night, I think you're working in about 7 facilities in the DC area, probably even going up and around Baltimore and areas like that. And Insight on the Inside is one of about 160 organizations that are part of this growing prison Dharma movement. And so I just really want to give them a shout out. It's the kind of work they're doing that's one person, one institution at a time, starting to transform our prison system and hopefully eventually our whole criminal justice system. So I want to start off today just by showing a short little film that'll give you a snapshot of our prison work. And then I'm going to kind of wind through different types of our work after that. And then we'll kind of come full circle and come back to the prison work towards the end. But let's start off with this film. So if we could go ahead. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Global Oneness Project, or Go Project Films, for the great job they did on that film, the Kalliopeia Foundation for funding that film, as well as funding a good chunk of our work. So I'm going to do something a little unusual for myself today. I am going to tell a bit of my story, which I almost never do. I'm a teacher of the work of healing and awakening, and that's primarily what I do around the world. I spend about 200 days of the year teaching or training or something like this in front of people around the world, and I just don't very often talk about my own story, but I thought it would be a good thing to do here at Budapest. I thought it might be helpful. So I did end up in prison in 1985. And I actually worked pretty hard at getting there. I was one of those folks that came up through the 1960s with a dual major in being a spiritual seeker on the one hand, but being involved in general craziness, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and experimentation, and all of that at the same time. 1966 was a particularly important year for me. I discovered marijuana, I discovered LSD, but more important than that, I discovered that I was a Buddhist, and how all that went together as part of the story, or the way that it ultimately doesn't go together. My girlfriend at the time also discovered that she was a born-again Christian and joined the Jesus Freak movement. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Jesus Freak movement, but I became a Buddhist, she became a Jesus Freak, and we broke up. And I've been dealing with that trauma ever since. And that's why I went to prison. No. So I was following that twisted road. I graduated from high school in 1968, which was a really kind of incredible year for this culture in this country. For those of you who were around back then, we had several assassinations, and it was a year of tremendous cultural and political upheaval in this country. And I graduated in the midst of that, angry, alienated, radicalized, and I went off to a big state university and majored in general craziness for the next 4 years, and but continued as a spiritual seeker at the same time. Ended up an IV drug user, doing, after the psychedelic era kind of started to wind down, the hard drug era ensued for a lot of us, and I got very deeply into IV drug use and a lot of real insanity. Knew I had to get out of that. Knew I couldn't go back to where I had started in my, good middle-class family. That upbringing and the culture I'd been presented with, it just didn't work for me, and I'd lost faith in it a long time ago. Good people, but the cultural context that I just had no alignment with anymore. So I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't stay where I was. So I decided to leave the country, and I always had this idea that somehow I'd find something real, something authentic in Latin America. I had this idea of going to Peru, and it had nothing to do with the drugs at the time. maybe in the back of my head it did somewhere, but it really wasn't about that so much. In fact, reflecting back on my childhood, I really remember there was a time in my early childhood when everything was kind of magical and tremendous sense of awe and power and just feeling really plugged in. And that all went away when I was 5 or 6. I could have had to do with some of the alcoholism in my family. Could have had to do with just going into the school system. I don't know, maybe it's just a developmental stage we're supposed to deal with, and I wasn't able to deal with it. But I was angry about it. I wanted that sense of authenticity and being plugged into something real back. I wanted it back in a desperate way. So in some ways, when I first ran into alcohol, I thought I'd rediscovered something, sex, drugs, and it had elements of plugging back into something that felt more real, felt more authentic than at least the environment and the culture that I was in at that time. But of course, those things all have tremendous baggage, especially when you're hurt and when you have a big hole in your gut that you're trying to fill up with things. But I was always looking, I was always seeking, so I thought I'd find something real in Peru. And it took quite a while to get down there, a long winding trail, eventually got down to Peru, and I did find something there. There's this real environmental magic there. For anyone who's been there, you wake up in the morning up in the Andes Mountains and amongst the Inca ruins and in these places, and it's just incredibly magical. And I was incredibly disappointed when I came back the first time after being down there for a couple of years and realized I had not brought that with me, that it was an environmental context that I had not internalized and couldn't bring back with me. So I've been looking for that all along. And the next place I really found it, that I felt I really discovered what I've been looking for my whole life, what I'd lost as a very young child, was when I met my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche. And I found out about Trungpa Rinpoche living high in the Andes Mountains in Peru in a very remote valley. And sometimes other travelers would find their way up to where we lived. And in 1974, some travelers brought a copy of Rolling Stone magazine, which had a big feature story about the first summer session at Naropa University, where Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching and also Ram Dass was teaching. And I had narrowed in my own self-study at that point, not only on Buddhism, but on Tibetan Buddhism. And there were only about 5 books that had been published at that time or translated, if you can imagine that. There's like thousands now. But there were about 5 books, and I was reading them. I had them in my little hut living way up in the Andes. And when I saw Trungpa Rinpoche's name, it just grabbed me by the throat, and I knew I had to go there. So I managed to get up there and come and enroll at Naropa University, and I became a student of Trungpa Rinpoche. But I kept this shadow life going. I kept this secret life as a part-time drug smuggler going, something I'd gotten into as a way to just live outside the system. And had justified it in my own mind in all kinds of ways. I'd become so politically alienated. I'd gotten into this outlaw mentality. I felt completely justified in living outside the system and being an outlaw, even being a Dharma practitioner. And certainly there was some cognitive dissonance around all that, some inner storytelling going on to keep juggling and making sense of that cognitive dissonance. But mainly I was self-medicating around it and continued my patterns of addiction. I'd spend about half the year traveling with my teacher. I was very fortunate to become one of his primary attendants, and I'd travel with him around the world and spend a lot of time with him in Boulder, Colorado, his home at that time. So I'd spend about half the year doing that, and I'd spend the other half of the year in my crazy life, being this part-time smuggler, cocaine cowboy. And it was a very insane and crazy life, and I knew it had to stop. I finally did stop in 1983. But others who continued, who I'd been involved with, decided when they got busted to invite me to the party. And so I was faced with a situation in 1985 of either going on the run or turning myself in. And I went to my teacher for counsel and revealed this whole shadow, secret life of mine to him for the first time. And he was incredibly kind and compassionate about it, and just very clear and upfront about the karma that I'd created for myself and others. Actually, we had one conversation about it, but then when it came closer and I realized I was definitely going to be indicted, he was in Canada, so I had a friend go up and talk to him, and I was trying to, should I go on the run or should I stay? I know, was this my karma I needed to face, or is this Reagan's drug war, some national karma I need to escape from? And I was really terrified of either alternative. I was terrified of going to prison. I was terrified of hitting the road on the run from the law. And he spent a few days contemplating it, and the word came back. He said, you need to stay. You need to face it. You need to turn yourself in. And even if you go to prison for 20, 30 years, you can still be a practitioner and a student. We can still work together. But if you're on the run, that would be very difficult. So for the first time in my life, I took somebody's advice, literally. I mean, all you had to do before to get me to do something was tell me to do the opposite, right? And, just use a little reverse psychology on me, because I never took anybody's advice. But I took my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche's advice, and I've never regretted it. And I turned myself in. During my trial and sentencing, I was in the county jail for 7 months, a completely hellish environment. And I was absolutely devastated, because when that cell door locked, the thing that hit me more than anything else was that my son, who was 9 years old at the time, was now going to grow up without a father. And I basically abandoned he and his mother and left him with nothing, just left him completely high and dry, and with the shame and this darkness of what was going on in my life. And it just really woke me up. And I became radically, passionately dedicated to trying to extricate any of the negativity and crazy out of my life and to do something good with my life. But at the same time, I was terrified. And in that county jail, it was an incredibly noisy, chaotic environment, and I couldn't sleep. And I was pretty much in a psychotic state for about 7 months, living on sleep deprivation, terrified of the world I was in. It was a very scary county jail to be in, terrified of the prisons I was likely to go to. And, but I was practicing. And I'd been a practitioner for 10 years already, received a lot of deep training from a profound spiritual master. That just shows you what a knucklehead I was. With all that training, I still managed to get into prison. And so I was sitting up on the bunk, top bunk, and practicing for hours every night. And one night, in the midst of all that chaos, they would let prisoners have TVs from home there and radios from home, and the noise and the yelling and the screaming at TVs and radios went on 24 hours a day in this jail. And I was sitting up there, and suddenly I found myself sitting in this very stable meditative state. Something I'd experienced many times in a lot of retreats. I'd done a lot of deep retreat practice, but never in this kind of environment. I was in the middle of absolute hell and chaos and noise, yet my mind wasn't moving, just wasn't moving at all. And I realized at that moment, I can do this. I can do this. I don't know what's coming. I don't know how long. At that point, I was facing life in prison. And I was charged with the so-called Kingpin statute. And but I knew I could do this, and I felt the blessings of my teacher and a strong sense of confidence. And I was incredibly grateful for that moment. Eventually, I did go to federal prison, and when I got there, I had the choice of trying to find some way to just kind of hole up and get by and be kind of a hermit in prison and keep my head down and stay out of trouble and get by, or to show up in that world and do something, to try to serve that community, be part of that community. And with the specter of my teacher, who, in my experience of him, and I'm from Missouri, the show me state, so I'm very skeptical by nature, and I watched him like a hawk all the time. And I never saw anything in him other than a profound desire to awaken other human beings, to reduce the suffering in the world, to awaken humanity. And he was at that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so having had, the modeling and the inspiration of that human being, he was just like right there on my shoulder all the time. So it really wasn't a choice. I had to find some way to show up. And this statement here that comes from the book Sacred Path of the Warrior, that the essence of warriorship, and what he meant by warriorship, he used that image of the warrior, the Shambhala warrior, not someone who's preparing to make war on someone, but talking about essential human bravery. And as we all know, it is no small thing being a human being. It's no small, even for those of us who have fairly privileged lives compared to the rest of the world, it's still no small thing getting up every day and facing the trials of this life, right? And so the bravery, to step into the bravery of our true destiny and heart as a human being. So the essence of warriorship, or the essence of human bravery, is refusing to give up on anyone or anything. And that has stuck with me my whole life from the very first time I heard it from him. And I heard it from him personally in the teachings that became part of that book. And it stuck with me my whole life. And it was really almost this burning, guiding flame that got me through 14 years in prison. So I decided in prison I really wanted to embrace that journey, and I wanted to embrace what had been missing in my life. I'd always been very interested in the the awareness parts of meditation. I was interested in the mind aspect, coming out of the whole drug exploration of the 1960s and 70s, and what I was really attracted to in Buddhism and the meditative traditions, I think along with a lot of my peers, was primarily the awakening, the awareness, the working with the mind in that way. And I had given short shrift to the ethical context of Buddhism, the precept practice. And I'd come, I was a recovering Roman Catholic, and I'd grown up in pre-Vatican II Catholicism, which was a pretty scary place to grow up. And fortunately, Catholicism has changed a lot, and I'm actually a lover of all the religious traditions today. But the one I grew up in was pretty scary. I had these great big nuns with sticks, telling me I was going to go to hell all the time. And so anything that was kind of about do and don't and commandments and right and wrong, I was kind of trying to stay as far away as that as possible. And what a lot of us did in the 60s, because we just rejected that whole culture of the 1950s, coming out of Depression, World War II era, fear-based culture that our wonderful, beautiful parents had created. We just rejected the whole thing and threw out the rule book. And there we are out trying to do life on our own with no rules. And we made quite a mess of it. I certainly did, right? So I had shied away from that part. And I realized when I got locked up that that's what was really missing in my life. And I decided to build my whole life in prison based on the precepts. The basic lay precepts in the Buddhist tradition are to refrain from killing and to protect life. They're very similar to most religious precepts. In Buddhism, however, we take them not as commandments, but as practices, as a lens through which to see clearly our life and see clearly our habitual patterns so that we can heal and transform. And so it's to refrain from life and to protect life, to refrain from stealing and instead to be a steward of resources, to protect resources, to refrain from lying and to speak the truth, to refrain from the misuse of intoxicants and to refrain from sexual misconduct, and instead to practice unconditional friendliness and loving kindness with all beings, and instead of engaging in the misuse of intoxicants, to practice awakening. So I decided to completely ground my life in those. And further, I had this idea that if I could become a monk. Our Shambhala tradition, which is still my primary spiritual lineage, we have some monks, and we have Gampo Abbey up in Nova Scotia, which is an amazing place. But, in a community which is probably 20,000 people around the world, we have several 100,000 people going through our programs, but probably about 20,000 members, and we probably have 100 monks. So it's primarily a lay community. And Trungpa Rinpoche himself had disrobed and was a lay teacher. And but I had always been very inspired by the story of the Buddha and the history of the Buddha and the monastic tradition. And so I thought if I could really become a monk in prison, that could be a powerful transformative journey in which I could heal myself and do something of value that leave a better legacy for my son than just that his dad went to prison. And also maybe I could create a model that would benefit other prisoners. So I took vows with Trungpa Rinpoche I went to prison in 1985. Trungpa Rinpoche came to prison in 1989 to do an abhisheka for me in my Tibetan Buddhist tradition so I could continue with my practices. He did the Vajrayogini Abhisheka for me, for anyone that's familiar with that. And I also took novice vows as a novice monk in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition at that time. And those two things completely transformed the nature of my path in prison. This is Sakyong Mipam Rinpoche, who also came to the prison a few years later and did some further abhishekas for me so I could continue on my Tibetan Buddhist path. And I took further vows with him at that time. So these rites of passage were incredibly important in empowering me. And I was just able to deliver a fairly advanced program in the Shambhala lineage for a group of men in a prison in Eastern Oregon. I just did this last month. And there's a wonderful chaplain there named Trime Peisinger, who's a senior student in the Shambhala tradition. And she's a professional chaplain on the Department of Corrections staff there. She's been there for about 8 years. And she has a Sunday group that draws 50, 60 men every Sunday for meditation. But she had another group on Wednesdays where she managed to get 20 men. And these are guys who are in for very serious offenses: murder, rape, other sex offenses. and they're serving hard time. She managed to get them through 2 years of intensive programming in the Shambhala lineage, so much so that they could do this program called the Rigdon Weekend, which normally would take most of us on the outside 2, 3, 4 years of going to programs and study to be able to do that program. She got them through all that curriculum. I was able to go there and do this for them and then give them vows, to give them the precepts, which was part of this program. They took what are called the Shambhala vows, which is a very close correlate to the Hinayana and Mahayana vows in the Buddhist tradition, and it's basically taking precepts. And I was profoundly grateful to have that opportunity, because I've always felt that, I read a story when I was in prison that in Thailand there were some Buddhist monks who were involved in rainforest preservation that were ordaining old growth trees. Now that may sound kind of crazy to ordain a tree, but there's such a devout Buddhist culture in Thailand, despite all the craziness that goes on there, very devout Buddhist culture, and the loggers would simply not cut down an ordained tree. They would not do it. So I've always had this idea, and I hope to have many more opportunities to do this, of the power of ordaining men and women in prison as not only as a support for their path, but as a kind of protection, especially for prisoners who are serving very long sentences. In order to continue my path as a prison monk, even once I took novice vows in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, I couldn't wear monk's robes in prison. So there's really nothing, in some ways there's some correlates between being in prison and a monastery. People often make that comparison. Mostly everybody wears the same clothes. And you have 3 hots and a cots, and you don't have outside responsibilities. It's a fairly structured life. But that's pretty much where the parallel ends. Monasteries are set up for awakening and set up to deepen our spiritual context and spiritual ideals and practice. Prisons are set up for violence and oppression and shame. And most people in prison are trying to not be there in any way they can, to just sleep their way through their time or numb out and somehow get through the time. They're incredibly noisy and chaotic and full of violence and oppression and shame and anger and bitterness. So the parallel to a monastery gets pretty thin. But still structurally there is some similarity, and so there is a possibility that one could make that one's monastery, which is what I was trying to do. But still I didn't have the reminder, and practice, I know you all are practitioners, so you all know it's kind of, sometimes we just forget. We're involved in of our life, and oh yeah, I actually had this intention to work on myself or to practice, much less to take on the monastic practice, which was not just about celibacy for me, but really was about living by all of the precepts and really working on that really clear lens to really look at all the habitual patterns of my behavior on a moment-to-moment basis through not only the 5 lay precepts, but in the Tibetan tradition, there's the novice precepts include 8 or depending on the system. And once I took the Zen precepts, there was 16 precepts. If you become a full monk, it's more like 100 things you have to pay attention to. But at any rate, I couldn't wear robes, so I had the idea, what if I could wear a rakusu, the Zen vestment, that people wear once they've taken Jukai, which is taken precepts in the Zen tradition. And my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, wore a rakusu often when he taught. He'd been given 2 rakusus, one by Maizumi Roshi, great Japanese Zen teacher, the other by Suzuki Roshi, one of the other really great Zen teachers to have come to America. And I used to care for those. I cared for Trungpa Rinpoche's robe as part of my job as one of his attendants. And before he taught, I'd be the person to put the robes on him and things like that. And so I had this idea, and I contacted one Zen teacher, and he said, well, you'd have to go through all these hoops, you'd have to and I was like, well, I don't know. That seems kind of difficult. But then I read about Bernie Glassman, Roshi Bernie Glassman, starting the Zen Peacemaker Order and ordaining the first Zen Peacemaker priest, who was an actor named Michael O'Keefe. And it just pierced me in the heart, this idea of being a fully ordained monk, but where your ministry and your life was not in the monastery, but in the streets. Like that was really the core of my heart and my passion, my inspiration. So I contacted Roshi Bernie Glassman and I was pretty, probably wrote a letter that probably would seem pretty cheeky, I said, I'm really not looking for another teacher. I'm not looking for another tradition and practice. I have more than I can deal with already in that area of my life, and enough practices to do for several lifetimes. But what you're doing is just, it's so close to my heart that I want to work with you. and I want to get involved in this. And Roshi wrote back, and he was just a complete yes. He said, absolutely. He said, you're exactly the kind of person I want to work with because of where you are and what you're doing. And so he came to the prison, and he started working with me. And I studied with Roshi Bernie Glassman and his wife, late wife, Sandra Jishu Holmes, who's over on the right there, on your left, I'm sorry. And, and I studied with them starting in about, I don't know, in my present 85, 87, around 1990 or so, and studied with them for the last 9 years that I was in prison. And I got permission from my teacher, Sakya Mipom Rinpoche, to do so. And so they came, and that's when I took the Jukai vows, and they came back later and did the novice priest ordination for me. Interesting little anecdote on the world of prisons. When they did this Jukai ceremony, I was able, the chaplain at the time and the prison administration really kind of welcomed them there. It wasn't so hard to arrange to do that. And I was very involved in a lot of things having to do with prison chapel, because I'll mention the prison hospice work in a moment. But we had started the first prison hospice in the world, and our clinical meetings happened in the chapel, and it was sponsored by one of the chaplains. And I was involved in a lot of interfaith work, and I was bringing my hospice patients down to Mass all the time. So I used to go to the Jewish group, because there was a young man in our Buddhist group who was also in that, invited me, so I went, I liked it. So I was very involved in kind of this interfaith way in the chapel. And so I was able to invite a lot of people, and it was a very celebratory event, and a lot of the guys from the Buddhist group came, and some of the other outside volunteers, the Jewish rabbi came, and some of the Christian and Catholic volunteers came, and it was this very celebratory event. It was a wonderful event. We had a reception afterwards, and just about 2 years later, 2 or 3 years later, when Bernie wanted to do the priest ordination for me, to ordain me as a Zen peacemaker priest, they didn't want to let it in. It really came in by accident, because the warden, the associate warden who had to make the decision, was out of town, and somebody else made a decision thinking he had already approved it, but he hadn't approved it. And then he got back and found out it was already in place, and he hadn't approved it, and he was very pissed off about it, but let it go ahead anyway. And then when it happened, that's why there's no photograph for this, because they refused to let any photographs be taken. They refused to let any other prisoners be there. They refused to let any other outside volunteers be there. And they wanted complete deniability around this. So we did it, and part of the ceremony when you're made a priest in the Zen tradition is they put the robes on you, right? So in the ceremony, they put all these robes on me, this beautiful kesa that had been gathered from pieces of cloth donated from people all over the world. And normally I would have sewn it myself like I did with my Roxu, but they weren't going to let me do it in prison. So friends from around the world sewed this patchwork kesa made up of cloth from all around the world, and from some people who had passed, and stuff from bearing witness retreats and street retreats, and some pieces from Trungpa Rinpoche's robe and Maizumi's robe. And so they put the robes on me, and then they wouldn't allow a picture to be taken of it, but there was a security mirror there, so Bernie made me go over, even though the guards didn't want it, he made me go over and look in the mirror so I could see myself wearing robes on the mirror. Then they took the robes off, put them back in a package, and they had to take them back out of the prison. And so the prison basically wanted to say, okay, it happened, but it didn't happen. It gives you a little window into the world of prisons. But at any rate, I became a prison monk, both in the Tibetan tradition and the Zen tradition. And I was able to wear that Roxu. I couldn't wear it around the prison, but I could wear it in the chapel. And that mala that I wore around my neck, I actually managed to battle with the prison administration a bit and get written permission and a document to wear that. And I wore that everywhere, and that was my primary reminder that I was a monk and that I was really wanting to embody this practice of a monk. And guards would often challenge me, and I'd have my piece of paper and pull it out, and they'd read it, and they'd growl, you know, and I'd stick it back in my pocket. The Zen peacemaker work is grounded in what are called the three tenets. And, you know, you can find these universally in human traditions. These were articulated by Bernie Glassman and others in the Zen peacemaker work, but they really represent basic human wisdom. And the first tenet is called not knowing. And what we mean by not knowing is letting go of fixed ideas, any fixed ideas we have about ourselves, about others, or about the world. You know, I think all the great spiritual traditions, and certainly all the inner practices of the indigenous traditions, shamanic traditions, philosophical traditions, all the great contemplative traditions around the world, I think all of the inner practices are really about how do we get out of conditioned mind into direct experience. I mean, that's really what it's all about. And obviously, it's much easier said than done. Our conditioning is a very worthy opponent. And I think a lot of us give short shrift to that and don't make the progress we could on the path because we don't realize how deeply conditioned we are and how that conditioning will co-opt even our most profound spiritual practices just to kind of continue living in what Tara last called the spacesuit last night, right? So not knowing is how do we step out of that? And it's easier said than done. And in the Zen Peacemaker tradition, Bernie and others have devised some really powerful methodologies for doing that. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment, the bearing witness retreats and the street retreats. The second tenet is bearing witness, and that's to bear witness to the joy and suffering of life, to actually let it touch us without the protection of our knowing. We're meaning-making machines. The minute our attention notices anything, we start attributing meaning to it, and we attribute meaning to it out of our conditioning, and then we turn it into something known, and now I can breathe silently. Okay, I know what that is. I don't have to deal with my existential panic in this moment. I know what that is. I know who I am. It's all okay again, right? That's what we're constantly doing very rapidly. So to actually be touched by life and let life penetrate us without the protection of that knowing is incredibly profound. And again, easier said than done. So that's bearing witness. And then out of that comes loving action or compassionate action. And I have a theory about how this works. I have a profound experiential belief in the innate basic goodness of all human beings, of all of life, even of human society altogether. And that's the core principle in my Shambhala tradition. And I'm very skeptical by nature, so I worked on developing that experiential faith in that over the years. In fact, when I was in prison, I had this little project going on, which I'm not proud of, but you know, I was looking for that proof that, in fact, not all human beings have basic goodness. And there were a lot of good candidates for that amongst my fellow prisoners and amongst the guards. And so I was there for a long time, and I would kind of track them, you know. But every time I finally thought I had my man, whether it was one of the prisoners or one of the guards, like here's a human being who has no redeemable qualities whatsoever, does not have an ounce of goodness in them, not an ounce of humanity or heart in them. The minute I thought I'd really had them nailed, they would inevitably expose their heart to me. Inevitably, every single time. And it took quite a few years being a skeptic that I am, having grown up in Missouri, the show me state. But I finally gave up the project, and I developed this profound experiential faith in basic goodness. So my pet theory about how the three tenets work is to what extent we can get into not knowing, right, and start to really let real data in, because, you know, we're not filtering it through our knowing, and we're not protecting ourselves with our knowing. We're really letting the world touch us directly, and so we're getting real data. So when real data or real information or genuine direct experience of life as it is, context, basic goodness, what do you get? You naturally get compassion and wisdom-based responses to life. So that's the three tenets that guides the peacemaker work. Trungpa Rinpoche in the Shambhala tradition would have talked about this as non-conceptual mind. And he talked a lot, the practice of meditation was that we learn how to take our seat properly. In anywhere in life, but it's a good metaphor for meditation, because in meditation usually we start by sitting, right? Sitting meditation, you sit your butt on the cushion, and as Jack Kornfield I think said, you sit your butt on the cushion and you take what you get, right? And you stay there. And so Trungpa Rinpoche called that holding your seat, which comes from the equestrian tradition called dressage, which his wife was a master of. So you hold your seat, right? And if you're willing to sit in that hot fire of your own stuff, of the charnel ground between our own ears, you sit in that fire long enough, it burns up all the dross, right? And this natural radiation occurs. And it's that radiation that we then have to offer to others, that we can hold space for others and create a space in which others can find their seat and do their own healing work. So that would be Trungpa Rinpoche's version of this 3 tenets. And you would find this really in all human traditions. So one of the things that was readily apparent to me when I got to prison, and something that I was both grateful for and highly disturbed by, grateful for because when I got to prison after 7 months in the county jail and finally getting sentenced to 30 years in prison with no parole, I had a no parole. Back then they still had parole in the federal system. They don't anymore, unfortunately. But back then they did. But I had a no parole sentence. And I was threatened with, on my sentencing day, I was going to get somewhere from 20 years to life. And whatever I got would have been no parole. And the only way out of that is then a presidential pardon. And I was pretty scared, as you can imagine. But I was hoping for the best. I was hoping for 20. And when I got 30, I was standing up in front of the judge. My knees buckled. My lawyer had to hold me up. And so when I got to prison, you can imagine I was pretty caught up with the drama of my own situation. And I got to this federal prison, the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, which is in southwest Missouri, Springfield, Missouri. I thought I was going to go to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. My case was in St. Louis, which was another tragedy. My family's from there. My case really had nothing to do with St. Louis, but the authorities managed to put it there because of all the press they were going to get. And so my family and my nieces and nephews and my son had to read the papers for 7 months about me and all of that. Something I still deeply regret. But I thought I'd go to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, but they sent me here. And they had a general population of about 300 inmates just to help run the place. I ended up teaching school. And they had 1,000 medical patients and 300 psychiatric patients there. And this was 1985. The AIDS epidemic was just going into full swing. And I got there, and at first it was a relief because I was out of this county jail cell into this great big huge prison, and you could walk around, and I could get a job, and there was recreational facilities, and there was a yard, so that was a relief. But as I walked around this place in the first few weeks, I was seeing men being wheeled around in wheelchairs, completely emaciated with AIDS or cancer. I was seeing men doing the Thorazine two-step, walking down the hall, completely over-medicated with psychotropic drugs. I was seeing men who were blind being led around. Can you imagine being blind and being in prison? Once I got up in the hospital wards, I went up with a volunteer organization and started showing movies up to the hospital wards, and I saw men who were quadriplegics, and they were in prison. And I realized I had found myself into this complete hell realm of deep, deep, profound suffering. A charnel ground, if you're familiar with that image of the charnel grounds, this is where in Asia they would take people who couldn't even afford the wood for a funeral pyre to be burned. They're just thrown out in the wild, and it became the image of these places of demons and jackals, like the scariest place, like Pema Chodron's book, Places That Scare You. While the Asian, especially Indo-Tibetan image for places that scare you, the ultimate place was the charnel ground, and the yogis would go there and live in the charnel grounds to overcome their deepest seated fears. So this was a true charnel ground, and it really woke me up because obviously I was surrounded by people who had it much worse off than I did. And my own drama of my own situation paled compared to what the men were going through there. So that woke me up. That's the part I was grateful for, but I was also incredibly disturbed by the amount of suffering. And the AIDS epidemic, as I said, was going into full swing, and they were bringing the AIDS patients from all over the federal system there. And initially they had them locked up in a psychiatric ward to keep them protected from the general population because there was so much fear. They were afraid the men in the general population might start attacking them because the men in the general population thought the feds were bringing them there as an experiment to see if we would get AIDS, because there had really been no education done around AIDS or anything. There was a tremendous amount of fear. So I started advocating to get them out of there, and I contacted national organizations and started doing a lot of advocacy. And I met another inmate who was a prisoner, obviously another prisoner who lived on one of the medical wards who'd been shot in his capture. He was a counterfeiter, really interesting guy, had arms about this big, weightlifter, martial artist, a very funny guy. but he'd been involved in counterfeiting. He got shot in his arrest, so he was paraplegic. He was in a wheelchair. But he could get around that whole prison faster than anybody else could, and he had this incredible sense of humor. He would even wheelchair right up to the warden and start pulling practical jokes on the warden and stuff. And he was so funny, he could get away with amazing stuff. Very interesting guy. But he was living on the hospital wards, and he befriended an AIDS patient and befriended a cancer patient and just stuck with them as their friend through their dying process and realized that there was a huge need for this. And I was kind of working on the other end of this advocacy work. We found each other, and we managed to start the first hospice program inside a prison. And that was what I did with my meal breaks and my weekends and my evenings for the last 11 years of my time. And that's 2 of my hospice patients there. We're out on the ward. And it's huge, really probably the most transformative part of my journey there was showing up and being really like a family member and caregiver with these men who were dying. I worked with about 40 men. We were assigned particular patients. And I worked with about 40 men over those 11 years. And about 37 of them died in prison. About 3 of them got out. And I was with about 20 of them when they died. And I also got very involved in training other prisoners because we had to keep training. We tried to keep a group of 10 inmate volunteers, but the population was very transient in this prison, so we were continually training new people. And it was a huge part of my life there. So I want to talk just briefly about another part of the Bearing Witness work, and that's the street retreats. After I started working with Bernie, I was really looking forward that one day when I got out of prison, if I ever got out, I'd be able to do the street retreat, because that was a real rite of passage in the Zen Peacemaker work. I also wanted to go to Auschwitz and do the Auschwitz retreat, so I was looking forward to that. So this is my first street retreat with Bernie in New York City in 2001. And out on the streets, you get out there. A lot of people hear about the street retreats. Oh, isn't that kind of voyeuristic? Or you're out there, you're not really homeless. You know, are you taking advantage? Is it exploitative? Well, they're very natural and normal questions for someone to have. I've never seen someone who's been on a street retreat have those questions. Because after you get out there and you're in that world and you've been sleeping on the streets and you have no money and you're hungry for a few days and you're tired and you're wet, you begin to experience something different. And you realize that that world that you think you belong to, those other people walking around who are part of that kind of middle class world or whichever world we belong to, working class or upper middle class world, but people with normal clothing and a wallet in their pocket and a purse and a credit card and so forth, or maybe a car and a job or a home to go to, you realize that they're looking at you as either they don't see you at all or they're not looking at you like a member of their club anymore. And you experience what people of color and poor people and women in the workplace have been experiencing forever. And it's an incredibly profound experience. And so your whole worldview changes. And all your reference points about who you are and how the world works are stripped away, and you find yourself in that place of not knowing. Bernie had the idea, instead of doing a sesshin in a regular zendo, let's do it out on the streets and see what happens. Right? And now street retreats have happened all over the world, major urban centers all over the world. And you find, after a couple of days, it's just like the scales come off, and you're in that place of not knowing, and you're bearing witness to your own suffering, you're bearing witness to the suffering around you. And so it's been a very powerful part of the journey as well. You know, we're going to have this Mindful Leadership Summit here that I'm really happy that Eric and Gabriel and more organizing. And there's a lot of mindfulness-based work in the world today. And I'm very involved. We changed the name of Prison Dharma Network to Prison Mindfulness Institute because we want to get mindfulness-based programming into the mainstream of correctional programming. We're still supporting all the faith-based, Dharma-based work in the prison chapels, but only a small percentage of prisoners will ever access chapel programming. So it's very important this go into the mainstream. We're now doing mindfulness-based training with correctional officers and police officers and probation and parole officers. Right? So it's very important. And there's also some dangers. And people have been raising the issues. Is this mindfulness light? And is it being brought into the military without the ethical context that comes along with it? People even have talked about mindfulness and ideas like that. You know, anytime a movement goes into the mainstream, there's all these dangers. And I'm very involved in this movement, but at the same time, I'm very well aware of the dangers. And so I think it's important for us to remember that the Buddhist tradition came out of suffering. That the context of the Buddha's Shakyamuni Buddha's awakening was bearing witness to suffering. He lived in a world of tremendous pleasure and privilege, And when he was exposed to suffering, that's what awoken him. And then he continued his journey. And the Buddhist tradition is a response to suffering. So it's very important that these benefits of mindfulness move into the mainstream and benefit everyone. But I think it's also very important, and that's why the subject of this talk is called Dharma at the Edge, to not forget our roots. To not forget our roots. That it's really about working with the suffering in life and working with the people that Bernie Glassman calls the people falling through the cracks, the marginalized. And if our Dharma tradition loses its roots in that, it will be clearly far adrift. So one of the things we bear witness to in our country, 610,000 homeless people in the USA. Now that's what they call a point-in-time snapshot. So if you pick a particular day, that would be the average in 2013. That doesn't mean that's how many people are moving in and out of homelessness. There's probably 5 times that many people moving in and out of homelessness in a given year, maybe more than that, at least 5 times more, right? So it's millions of people that are moving in and out of homelessness. Here in Washington, D.C., 6,865, which is it's gone down a little bit nationally, but it's gone up in Washington, D.C. I don't know what the roots of that are. A lot of it is housing issues and things like that, but it is going up in your area. And again, that's a snapshot. So there's probably, there's probably 20, 30, 40,000 people moving in and out of homelessness in this area over a given year. This is council practice on a street retreat in Austin, Texas. In Austin, we decided, we often do our street retreats in the middle of the winter in cities because, the idea is to deal with suffering and our own suffering. In Austin, we decided to do it in the heat because what's the scariest thing for homeless people in Austin is the heat. So we went there in the 3rd week of August, and it turned out to be the hottest week of the year. And it got up to 115 degrees every day on the retreat. And even in the middle of the night at 2 a.m. in the morning, we'd still be up wandering in the streets, and the sidewalks would be radiating heat, just like really facing an oven. There was no way to get away from it. It was definitely the toughest street retreat I ever did. In fact, I thought I was going to die of heat exhaustion at one point. Another place that bearing witness work has gone is in post-conflict zones and conflict zones, places of war and other places of suffering. So we went to Jerusalem in the middle of the second Intifada that started in 2000. We were there in 2001. And Bernie's been going back there every year since then. So we went there and we were bearing witness. That's Alan Senauke, who a longtime peacemaker and at one point a 10-year director of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, and bearing witness to the incredible suffering of that place at that time. We were the only Westerners there in Israel at that time, and everybody was suffering. The Jewish population, the Palestinian population, the Arabs, the Jews, the Muslims, everybody in deep, deep suffering. And we all know what a place of suffering, how that's, I'm not going to talk about these things today, but in the Mindful Leadership Summit, I'll be talking about my radical responsibility model and talking about the triangulation of drama and how that happens. And obviously there's been a drama triangle going on in Israel forever. And it has spawned other drama triangles like the Afghan war and the Iraqi war and this stuff, this human drama that we carry around between our own ears and perpetuates abuse in our families and destruction in our communities and global war and destruction. It's something that we hold inside of us, and the outer representations of it will continue until we take responsibility for it. So the bearing witness work is to go to these places and realize, how can I take responsibility for this? How is this me? Right? How am I continuing to participate and perpetuate this in the world? And how through owning it and bearing witness to it can I become part of the solution? This is a weekly bearing witness peace gathering on a balcony overlooking the Wailing Wall in the old city. And this is Auschwitz. Christina talked about the event a moment ago. I've been going to Auschwitz every year for 14 years now, every November. It's usually the first week of November. This year it's going to be the second week of November. And I've also had the privilege of delivering this training called the event over that same time period. And the event is a profoundly transformational training or workshop that was developed inside a maximum security prison in Marion, Illinois, which used to be the supermax in this country, back in the 1970s by a psychiatrist named Martin Groder and an inmate named Kenny Wines. Kenny Wines was on his third serious prison sentence for violent offenses. He was never supposed to get out of prison. He was a hardened convict. And Marion was the toughest prison. Marion was built to replace Alcatraz. And he got himself into this class with this psychiatrist that was held, a group that was held in a particular part of the prison for one reason only. He wanted to go to that part of the prison to case out his escape plan. He was going to try to escape from Marion. No one had ever escaped. So he starts going to this group, which was based on the principles of transactional analysis with this psychiatrist, Martin Groder. And these were tough convicts. I mean, these are the toughest of the toughest convicts. And he was so amazed by what this psychiatrist was doing with these men and how profoundly he could challenge them that he became more interested in who the psychiatrist was and what he could do than in his escape. He completely gave up his plans for escape. And at one point, he got an appointment with the psychiatrist, with Dr. Groder. And he went and he said, I want to be who you are. I want to be able to do what you do. How did you learn to do this? This is what I want in my life. And, Dr. Groder kind of thought, well, yeah, right, And, so how do I get rid of this guy? So he said, well, come back tomorrow and I'll give you some information. So he wrote down all the courses he had ever taken, all the way through all his training, clinical training and certifications to get where he'd gotten. And he gave a list, said, okay, here's what you got to do. And he figured that would be the end of that. Well, this inmate, he managed to get a college program started at Marion Prison, which was unbelievable that they would start a college program in that kind of prison. And he started taking the courses. And he started working with Dr. Groder. And eventually, they let him go outside to sit for the transactional analysis certification exam. He scored higher than anybody ever had on the exam. And he and Dr. Groder started a therapeutic community at Marion based on a model they called the Salapian therapy. And they had a process called the GAME, which had roots in a lot of things coming out of the human potential movement of the 1960s. But it was very intense confrontational work, grounded in a teaching context. A lot of the principles coming out of transactional analysis. And they did that for many years. And at some point, interesting in terms of Leslie's film, and great gratitude to you, Leslie, for this really, really important film. And the question that was asked about the governor up in Wyoming and, overruling the decision of the parole board. Well, what happened back then, which probably wouldn't happen today, and the mood is starting to change, but it's really just barely beginning to change. Things have been tough out there for a long time. Just heartless. Absolutely heartless. But this was back in the 70s, and it was a little different back then. And the parole board came to Kenny Wines, and he said, we're going to parole you. You don't need to be here anymore. It's really obvious. We don't need to keep you in prison anymore. Which doesn't have anything to do with why parole boards make decisions these days. But they said that to him, and he said, well, I can't go. I haven't finished my training. Can you imagine that? And they were dumbfounded, as you can imagine. They said, well, let us know when you're ready to go. And he said, okay, I will. He stayed another 18 months to complete his training. And then he said, okay, I'm ready to go. And he got out and he started a training on the outside. And my closest spiritual brother in the university, a man named Purna Steinitz, who's a spiritual teacher in another tradition, he met him and trained with him for 6 years. And then Kenny said, you need to go out and start your own training. You're ready to do the work. And Kenny went off to New Zealand and continued to work over there. And my friend Purna started his version of it called The Event. And he used to do 25 or 30 events a year. I don't know how he ever did that. Had programs all over North America and Europe. And that was all still very active when we met each other. He wanted to use some of my writing in his post-event curriculum. They had a follow-up program, and they gave people a lot of curriculum, and I've been publishing stuff from inside prison. So we got in contact, and he came to visit me, and within 3 minutes, we were like, we were long-lost spiritual brothers. And we didn't have to do any of the stuff you would normally have to do to get to know someone. We were just immediately, completely bonded. And we started working together. And I managed to get the event into the prison, which was a miracle in of itself. This is a maximum security federal prison. And I got us 2 psychologists from the prison to go out and do the event on the outside. They loved it. They kind of smuggled it in because it actually did smuggle the stick. We do stick work in the event. We have a great big stick and we beat on a pillow as a way to get people in touch with, one way we get people in touch with their rage and their anger. I shouldn't have told anybody about that because we're trying to market the event here. But anyway, can you imagine giving these big, tough convicts, I mean, these are serious convicts, a big stick inside a prison to let them hit stuff with? I mean, it kind of goes against normal correctional philosophy. But we did 4 of the events, 30 hours during the last 3 years I was there. A 30-hour training over 3 days and a 12-week follow-up program, one morning a week for 12 weeks. And the men come in all armored up, about 32 men in each event, all armored up, all posturing and like that. And by the second day, they're holding each other in each other's arms, going deep into the trauma that is in every one of their lives. People that hurt people have been hurt. People that hurt people have been hurt. Or as a convict at San Quentin in a group said, hurt people hurt people. And then another convict in the same group said, yes, and healed people heal people. And these men, we had 32 men, I would say every time about 90% of them had experienced as children severe off-the-charts child abuse that would just break your heart. Sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, just horrific stuff. It's no surprise that people end up in prison and end up in trouble and end up hurting people and hurting themselves. They're programmed to do so, which doesn't mean that personal responsibility isn't part of the pathway out of that. It absolutely has to be. But we also have to remember where it comes from. So I started leading the event when I got out of prison with Perna, and we've been leading it every year together for the last 13, 14 years, and we're going to do it twice this year for the first time I'm very happy about. But every year I've been doing the event in October and 2 weeks later going to Auschwitz. And this led to a profound understanding for me, which has really continued to inform my work. In the event, and we just market it out to the public. I know somebody in this room is going to come. And people come because they want to break through in some area of their life. We call the event a breakthrough training. You know, we're stuck in relationship, we're stuck in our business, our livelihood. Some part of our life is not working with our kids. Some aspect of our life is just not working. We want to get it unstuck. Maybe even our spiritual practice feels like it's plateaued, it's not going anywhere. So people come there to get unstuck in pieces of their life. And it's just whoever comes. It's self-selecting. And it's heartbreaking for me every year at some point as we get into this very intense 3-day, now 4-day training this year, 12 hours a day, 4 days, that the amount of abuse that's in the room, the amount of child abuse and sexual abuse and trauma that's in the room every time. And to see that suffering. And the event, we use pretty radical means. It's an old school kind of training. And, but it works. But you know, even me, I don't lead the event all year long every year. So as I'm approaching leading the event again, oh my God, the event, I can't believe I'm going to do this again. It's like really crazy. But every time I finish leading an event, I say, oh God, I wish we could lead one next week. Because in the event, I get to see the chain break of how that trauma and internalized abuse and oppression and trauma gets passed on from one human being to another. That parents pass it on to their children, that bosses pass it on to their workers. We pass it on to our coworkers. We pass it on to institutions and families and organizations and countries. And I actually literally get to see the chain break, and I know this human being is not going to pass it on to others. In fact, what they're going to pass on is healing. They're going to become a source of healing. Doing that in juxtaposition with going to Auschwitz every year and seeing the most profound example of this internalized shame and oppression, really, I began to see it's the same thing. What I see in the event and what I see at Auschwitz and what I was seeing in Israel and what I've now seen in Rwanda, that it's exactly the same thing. And I began to understand that we are globally carrying a toxic load of internalized shame and oppression that is completely unsustainable and will continue to erupt in warfare and abuse and genocide forever. And it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse until we find some way to drain the swamp, to lessen this load of toxicity and to stop adding to it. And every time there's another instance of child abuse or child neglect or a war or a genocide or a refugee situation or alcoholic families, we add to this pool. And the way that we enculturate our children in this country, and mostly in the West, and now it's becoming globalized, I would say that we live in a very shame-based world. We all want to enculturate our children in the culture because we want them to be safe and happy. We want them to have a good life. But we've all bought into some kind of cultural framework, much of which is arbitrary. And the message we're giving to our children, benevolently or not so benevolently, and often very ignorantly at times, or abusively, is conform or you'll be rejected. And the human emotion of shame is that which we feel when we're told we don't belong, and we're not wanted, and we're not good enough. And that shame becomes internalized and eventually comes out as rage and aggression, inevitably and always. So I began to see it the same work, and I see that if we're really interested in having a safer, more peaceful, healthier, saner world, we have to find a new way to educate our children. And there are lots of wonderful alternative models out there, but they're not being mainstreamed. They're beginning to be. The mindful school movement is the first kind of movement beyond the small alternative private schools. Right? But we need to find a non-coercive way to enculturate our children. Many sociologists have shown how our public school system in a prison is on a pipeline. It's the same culture. It's the same shame-based context. So we go to Auschwitz to bear witness to genocide and to bear witness that this is our reality. We have to own this. This is what we do as human beings. This is not what some horrible people have done. We do this. We human beings are still capable of this. It's happening still in Darfur. Horrible violence against women and children is happening in the Congo right now. Rwanda, where with colleagues I helped start the Bearing Witness Retreat there back in 2010, and that work is continuing. The most recent Bearing Witness Retreat just happened in April. We're now, they processed over 1 million accused genocide perpetrators through a restorative justice, community justice, Gacaca court process in Rwanda. And those who were willing to repent and confess their crimes and tell where the bodies were buried, which is really important for the victims and the family members to find their loved ones, they were given shorter sentences or sent to work forms. And most of them have been brought back into society. Some of them were released. And Rwanda is like the most profound laboratory for peacemaking on the planet right now. It's really quite amazing. Since the 1996 genocide, and throughout this whole time, Rwandans, Hutus, and Tutsis have been living together next door to each other in the same villages, living next door to the people that brutally butchered their own family members, and having to go on and find a way to rebuild their country together and live together. It's quite amazing. And many of the prisoners have been reconciled and they're back in that process, but there's a whole other group of the prisoners that wouldn't repent or wouldn't admit their guilt. And they're doing hard time. And the government realizes now they've really screwed up. They've kind of ignored them. They've just been sitting in these maximum security prisons and prison farms for the last 18 years or so. And they're going to get out over the next 2 years. So we're having a meeting in Italy with Rwandan corrections people and Rwandan reconciliation folks and American corrections people this November to talk about how to deal with reentry with this kind of situation and how to do the kind of reconciliation work that Leslie's film points to. History of tremendous violence is part of the truth of our 20th century and the first genocide of the 21st century in Darfur. Continuing rites of passage in the Zen Peacemaker work. And rites of passage are really important ways that we empower ourselves in the work, that we convince ourselves that healing is possible, that Buddha nature and basic goodness are realities, that the innate goodness of humanity is a reality. And in fact, there is a context for never giving up on anyone. Trungpa Rinpoche lost his own country. His own guru was killed by the Chinese communists. He had to escape into India, losing most of his people along the way, has seen what's happened to his country over the many years, and never gave up on humanity, refused to demonize the Chinese or anyone else, and never gave up on humanity. And rites of passage are important ways that we affirm this in ourselves. So I was able to be empowered as a sensei with Bernie Glassman. And Bernie Glassman very much believes in empowering partnerships. So when you have the sensei, if you're in a relationship with, I was with my lovely love of my life, Denise at that time, who I unfortunately lost to cancer 5 years ago. At the culmination of the ceremony, he has the person who's become the sensei, right? Now you're the big cheese, right? I get down and do 3 prostrations to my partner and give her a bouquet of roses. And she's empowered as the actual leader in this dynamic. You know, Denise was, she was a profound Buddhist teacher and practitioner, and she just was somebody who just had her life together on every level. She never compartmentalized her life. You know, when she embraced the Dharma back in the 70s, she just let it into every part of her being. Unlike me, who kept all kinds of little private places where I wasn't going to let the Dharma get to, thank you very much, right? But so she just had that kind of integrity. And so when we got together, you know, she said, look, honey, you do really well in structured environments. I mean, you flourished in prison. So I'm the new warden, and just surrender, and you're going to be happy. It's going to be okay. And so we jokingly called her Warden Thornton. And she was a good warden. And so Bernie empowered her as the official Warden Thornton there at that ceremony. This is at Auschwitz, sitting in meditation at the selection site where Dr. Mengele would send people right into the gas chamber for immediate death, or off into the work camps for death by starvation and overwork in the elements. And this is one of our Rwandan peacemaker friends sitting next to me. And out of that work, we decided to birth a retreat in Rwanda. So here we are in Rwanda, and this is our co-founders, incredible peacemakers, Isa Higiro and Dora Uheni, who've been working with supporting Hutus who rescued Tutsis during the genocide, as well as supporting profound reconciliation work. We sat during this first retreat in a circle with mostly Tutsis who are professionally involved in reconciliation work, working for the leading NGOs and government agencies, doing the reconciliation work in the country. A few convicted Hutu perpetrators, but the people that presenting were 3 pairs of people who were a Hutu genocidaire, a perpetrator of genocide, and the survivor of their victims, and they had reconciled. I was thinking about this the whole time watching your film, Leslie, and they had reconciled. And out of different contexts. For one, it was a deep Christian context. For another, it was just kind of they were neighbors, and they just somehow organically discovered each other's humanity through their children. So different contexts, but they shared their stories of profound reconciliation. And one of them talking about how their children play together as they stayed in each other's homes, and the other Tutsis in the circle, some of them were aghast. And they worked for reconciliation, but this was too much for them. They said, several of them spoke out loud in their circle and said, "You're crazy. I wouldn't let a Hutu stay in my home for love or money. I'd be afraid they'd murder me in the middle of the night." So there's still tremendous fear and trauma there. And yet in the midst of that kind of reconciliation is possible. And those are 2 amazing peacemakers that their lives are dedicated to that. That's Genro Gaunt on the far left, a Zen teacher who spends his whole year in and out, doing nothing but bearing witness retreats and street retreats. This is one of the memorial sites, the human remains of the genocide. And we spend time, that's what we do on the Bearing Witness retreats. We just sit in silence with the reality of what we human beings are capable of doing and have done. This is Murambi, where the French were complicit in covering up the genocide there, and they buried the bodies, and they threw lime on them so that they wouldn't smell. And then they had a French garrison over the top of that, and it was discovered later. And the bodies were preserved, so they're like kind of leathery cadavers. And this technical school has like 15 buildings, and it's full of these bodies. And we went there. The survivors who lived there were the survivors of that massacre, and they worked there to guide people there. They came with us, and there were like about 50 of us, Rwandans and internationals, and they walked with us hand in hand, holding our hands as we walked through the rooms, and people just sobbing. And they just held our hands and took care of us the whole time we were there. And they lived there with this place. This is listening to one of the survivors at Murambi. He was there at Murambi and survived. He has a bullet hole in his head up here, and he was telling his story. That's Father John on the right, who does restorative justice prison work throughout Rwanda. Amazing work. This is a prison camp where we're in dialogue with 5 genocide perpetrators who have not repented and are basically still blaming the system and blaming the organizers and blaming everyone. And that's why they're still in prison. And we were having a dialogue with them. Another rite of passage with Rosie Joan Halifax, who was here yesterday, my senior priest ordination a few years ago at Upaya, which is a Zen center dedicated to bearing witness work. So I want to finish just talking a little bit about the prison system. We all know about this prison industrial complex. It became a self-perpetuating industry. We've got 2.3 million people in prison, 7 million people under some kind of correctional supervision. And it's highly racist in its organization and impact. It's mostly poor people and people of color that we're locking up. Young African American males have a much greater chance of going to prison than going to college in our country. It's a completely unsustainable system. And everyone in the system is suffering. The prisoners, the families, the correctional officers, police officers, jailers, probation and parole officers. Correctional officers who serve 20 years inside a prison on the line, their life expectancy is 58 years old. They retire and die. That's what they do. There's the level of anxiety, depression, suicide, drug abuse, spousal abuse, domestic violence, drug abuse is off the charts among correctional officers compared even to police officers and even to combat military vets. Higher levels of PTSD than Vietnam vets. There were 10 suicides among correctional officers in Massachusetts alone last year. We just finished a year-long training, mindfulness-based resiliency training, with 60 correctional officers in Oregon in response to a rash of staff suicides they've had there. So we're envisioning now a mindful justice movement to transform our crazy, out-of-control, destructive, retributive justice, vengeance-based criminal justice system into one that's based on healing, restoration, transformation, grounded in mindfulness and humane values. And it's actually becoming possible today. This thing is running itself now, it seems to have a mind of its own. Back in 1989, when I founded Prison Dharma Network from my prison cell, Bo and Sita Lazoff, who really, all of us doing this work stand on their shoulders, they took over Ram Dass's prison correspondence and launched the Prison Ashram Project and have impacted more prisoners with meditation-based prison work than anybody in the world. We lost Bo to a motorcycle accident just a couple of years ago. Sita's still continuing to work. John Daitalori had some prison meditation work going in New York State back then. There was very little going on. And I had my little meditation group going there at the federal prison. Since then, things have changed. Today, these are Prison Mindfulness Institute and the Prison Dharma Network community. These are our spiritual advisors. You recognize them as many of the preeminent Dharma teachers in our country. We have a community of over 5,000 people doing this work now, and over 180 organizations like the Insight on the Inside doing this kind of work around the world. And programs are going on in all these states. These are organizations and programs, and this isn't even complete. But there's at least 40 states that have well-organized prison work. And the last thing I wanted to put on here was, since Ram Dass will be with you this evening, I had the wonderful opportunity to come full circle and connect with Ram Dass and watch his film. If you've never seen, how many people here have seen Fierce Grace? An amazing film. If you haven't seen it, I would see it. we got to watch it together a few years ago at a training for peacemakers and people doing peace training. And this prison work really began with Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now. Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, found its way into the prisons, and prisoners started writing to Ram Dass and others, and Bo and Sita took over his work. And it's come a long way since then. But with much gratitude, I'd like just to end on this note. Unfortunately, in many ways, we've embraced an idea that humanity is somehow flawed, that there's something wrong with us as human beings. And it's a very minority view in human history. I think it's kind of a corruption of the Judeo-Christian tradition. I don't think it's the essential wisdom of those traditions, but it became dominant in the West, this idea of the flawed nature of humanity. And as long as we continue to feel bad about ourselves, we're going to create systems and institutions that represent that, fear-based, shame-based institutions and systems. The dominant view throughout all human cultures throughout time has been that of the innate goodness of human beings and of society itself. And we need to start national conversations about human goodness. So thank you very much.